We are live. Hey, Mediums, good evening. Welcome to our 6th episode of The Writer's Journey here on Keystroke Medium. So last week, we talked about coming up with a really compelling idea for your story and using your character's strengths and weaknesses to explore the conflict and tease out a plot. This week, we want to delve into those ideas on a deeper level. So we've brought Robert Kroese on, and he is the author of the Saga of the Iron Dragon series and the Rex Nilo adventure series. He's a hybrid author who has self-published a number of successful novels and has been published by St. Martin's Press, one of the big 5 publishers. Macmillan Publishers, one of the big 5. Rob was recommended to the show by Keystroke Medium's own in-house editor, Ellen Campbell. So if you have any questions for him about being a hybrid author or developing your story or about working with Ellen, put it in the chat, any questions at all, and we'll be asking him those questions. Before we get into today's topic, I thought we could briefly share what we've been up to recently. For me, myself, I've been doing a whole lot of editing. I've been working on a really fun fantasy novel by a friend in the UK. The novel is huge. His brother calls it a doorstopper, and it is, and I'm having a good time working through it. And that's me. That's where I've been up to, other than Christmas stuff, New Year's coming up. So Kayleen, what about you? What have you been up to?
Pretty much the same old same. Getting those outlines done on series 2. Working in the short stories for the anthology. New anthologies coming up for this year for Keystroke.
Yeah,
and
your future.
Yes, super excited. As you see, I do not have my normal backdrop. I had to pull some strings. I am currently broadcasting from my day job in the warehouse. So good times there. So if you guys hear beeps, I'm totally sorry. I can't do anything about those.
That is real dedication there. Broadcasting live from the job.
Yes.
And Rob, what have you been up to?
I have been writing like crazy lately because I have this series, as you mentioned, this trilogy, the Saga of the Iron Dragon, and I am about 95% of the way done with the 3rd book in the trilogy, and I have to have it on Amazon in about a week. So it's getting a little tight. I didn't plan for it to go this tight, but yeah. So I'm working really hard to get that finished. It's turning out really well. I'm happy with it, but it's getting it to the point where I'm happy with it. It's taking a little longer than I thought. And if anyone's wondering about this strange reflections and situation that I have here, I actually, I was explaining earlier, I actually work in bed a lot, and so I'm in bed right now. This is my workstation, so behind me there's this picture, and then there's a glare on it, which is my monitor, which is actually suspended over my bed, so I can lie down and work and look up at this. So that's why I'm in this weird configuration here.
Comfiest desk ever.
Weird, yeah, but awesome. It's fantastic.
What is that you're resting on?
This is like a foam wedge thing here, and it's got all these. I don't know if you can see, but it's got all these like fuzzies because I had this sweater that was like letting off these things. So I also have like this weird fuzzy blue sweater situation going on here. I don't know. It's kind of odd. But yeah, I got this foam wedge from Amazon, so then I can lie sort of semi-reclined. I have it like up on its side now, but usually I'm lying down and then just looking up, and then I can write, and then there's no tension on my neck or my shoulders or anything because I just have my keyboard on my lap basically, and then I could just write and not have to worry about. I'm always doing this, and I get all this tension in my neck and back and stuff, and it gets really bad. So I still have to. I switch between different writing positions, but this is what I do most of the time because it's super comfortable.
That was like a really good tip. So you've got this Saga of the Iron Dragon series, and book 3 is coming out quite soon in a couple weeks. Could you tell us a little bit about your writing, what you write, and what the series is about? I think it's an alternative, like time traveler history series. Right.
Yeah, alternate history, you could call it, or someone called it secret history, which is probably a little bit better description. Which is it's sort of like the kind of the aliens and the pyramid, building the pyramids kind of thing, where it's like how did stuff that happened in history that's like we don't know about, but and it resulted in what we have today. Alternate history is more like, well, what if Hitler, won the war, the Japanese won the World War II or something, and then we would you'd see the result of that. Well, but whereas the Iron Dragon series is more like, what if in the actual Middle Ages there were these people who went back in time and they had to get back to space. There's space travelers who also went back in time, and then they crashed basically in Norway in the Middle Ages in the 9th century, and they have to get back to space. So they basically have to, and it's an absolutely insane idea. They have to build a spaceship. They have to build a rocket to get back into space, but they have all the knowledge that they have and some of the equipment, but for the most part they have medieval technology, and there's that they're trying to work with. So it takes them decades to get this project done, and it's been a huge project. Just writing about it has been a huge project for me, just all the research and the work going into it, and it's a bit of a departure for me because I've written quite a bit of sci-fi stuff, but most of my stuff is probably about 3/4 of it is humorous stuff, just mostly for laughs. I mean, I just write to kind of for entertainment purposes, and this is the most probably the most. I mean, it's definitely the hardest sci-fi as far as research and historical accuracy and scientific accuracy that I've done. It's been a huge challenge. So I started off writing basically humor, and then it was sort of kind of Douglas Adams influenced sci-fi humor stuff. And then I did a little humorous fantasy. And then I like to do different things, though. So I changed it up a little bit with all of my books. And so this is a big departure for me to write something like this.
Yeah, I saw a title, Out of the Soylent Planet.
Yeah.
A pun off of C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet.
Right. That's
the real quick.
Yeah, those are the Rex Niolo books, which are I wrote this book called Starship Grifters, which is it's just kind of crazy sci-fi humor, sort of halfway between, if people know the old Harry Harrison Stainless Steel Rat books, and then the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy stuff. It's kind of halfway in between there, where it's just this guy who's this kind of swindler, con artist guy who just has these incredible delusions of grandeur and thinks he's going to do all these wonderful things and make billions and billions of credits, and flying across the galaxy, scamming people out of planets and things. And then he's got this long-suffering robot sidekick who is actually the narrator, and she's kind of constantly bringing him back to Earth or some planet, as it were. And it's just I wrote Starship Grifters, the original book, and the intention was just to put this character, make him do the craziest possible thing that I could think of that would be just absolutely absurd thing, and then just have this robot, this kind of straight man woman robot who's his sidekick going along with him and having to deal with all of this nonsense that he does. So they were a lot of fun to write, and I just finished the 4th book in that series. It's book 3 because I wrote book 1 and then I wrote a prequel, which was book 0, which is Out of the Soylent Planet, and then there's a sequel to the original, which is I, Robot, AYE, Robot, and then the 4th one is The Wrath of Khans, which is the book number 3, which is the 4th book. I'm confusing myself. So I just finished that one, and then I delved into I'm on book 3 of the Iron Dragon right now.
So you're definitely a punny guy. You like those puns.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of just terrible groan-inducing puns and every other kind of humor too. Like no joke is beneath me for these books, because it's just I mean there are jokes about there's a point where they find this there's a crate of robot arms, and so then there's all these terrible jokes about a farewell to arms, and being disarmed and all this stuff, and it just goes on, and it's awful. It's awful, but it's so much fun to write, and I can't resist it. So
that's fantastic. I bet Ellen had I don't know if Ellen was editing those books or not, but I bet she had a kick if she was reading those. She must have been laughing her head.
She likes those.
That's really great.
A great takeaway from that is when you're plotting, don't hold back. If an idea comes up, throw it in there. You can always take it out if it doesn't end up working.
And I have a general rule that if you come up with an idea and you think to yourself, oh, it would be awesome if that could happen, then that has to happen. I mean, because then the problem is if you come up with it, there's a chance that a reader is going to be reading it and they're going to think, oh, this could happen. And then if it doesn't happen, they're going to be disappointed. So generally, I mean, sometimes it just doesn't work. The plot doesn't go that way, and you can't make it happen. But generally, if I come across an idea where I think, oh, this would be amazing if that happened, then the plot somehow has to bend to make that happen because
somehow they're just going to take a weird side turn to make it go.
Yeah, which is why my books never follow my outlines either, because all these ideas hit to me while I'm writing. I have to have an outline to work with, but once I start writing and I'm like, oh, what would be even better is this, and then once I think of a better idea, then I have to work it in, and it all somehow ends up working out in the end, but.
Well, then it sounds like you really are the perfect person for tonight's show, because tonight we're talking about going from I have an idea to I need to get myself ready to start writing. I need to go from idea to developing it, thinking it all through, following the conflicts wherever they're going to go, developing the characters, to actually start plotting and figuring out that plot. And I guess being open to make changes. So with that segue, now I got to look at my question.
See, now you went off the reservation. You went off your outline, and you're confusing yourself.
I did. Well,
but it's great.
This is not a question that's at the top of my outline, but it makes the most sense. Like, so how do you go from I have an idea to I need to write my outline? Because you make outlines.
How do you go from an idea? Wait, what's the question again? How do you go from an idea?
How do you start developing your outline?
How do you start developing your outline? Well, what I do, I mean, I'm more of what you would call a pantser rather than a plotter, meaning that I make up a lot of stuff as I go along. So my outline is really more of a list of suggestions for myself. I usually have a point that I want to get to with the book, with the climax, and then you usually what happens is I will develop challenges that are appropriate for that climax, and appropriate for the characters to get to that climax. So there are the challenges that somehow relate to that climax and somehow relate to the character's need to accomplish something. So it's something within the character, and so then that they need to do, and something that's relevant to the climax, the events that need to happen. So then there are challenges along the way that kind of develop the situation, and usually what happens is there's some forward movement, but then there's usually back, you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but it's better if you can take like a lateral move where things don't work out the way that you expect, and so you throw a few kind of monkey wrenches in there. And usually, so then I'll have a list of, okay, I have to hit this point and this point and this point and this point and this point, and then I just start writing, and I try to write from, I have a point that I pick as the beginning, and then I write towards the next point that I need to hit, and then I hit that one, and I go to the point after that, and I keep going until I get to the end. And like I said, usually what happens is, I mean, that's sort of like the ideal scenario, but it never works out that way. I start working towards the first point, and maybe I hit that one, and then by the time I get to the second one, it's like, oh no, I've come up with a better idea for the second point, or the second thing. This character is not going to do that. That's not in their character, so I have to come up with a different way of doing that. But usually, enough ideas, if you can get in the process, enough ideas will come to you that you'll always have an idea to work toward. Sometimes you got to put it down for a day or two and think, okay, this isn't working out. I need I couldn't get to the point where I thought I was going to. But usually ideas will keep coming, and you can just keep writing towards, as long as you're writing towards something, you can keep going.
So do you then work out who your characters are before you're even thinking about what it is they're going to be doing? Kind of develop who they are first?
It depends on the book. My first books and the more humorous books, I tend to be more character driven. So like the Rex Neolo books are all about these two characters, and they're, because it's the situation they get in, and the humor of it all relates to who they are and the kind of stuff that they would do and how they react to things. So everything revolves around the characters, because I came up with this character in the first place, and then and his robot sidekick, and then just everything else. The universe revolves around those characters. And then my first novel is the same thing, where I have this character who's this angel, kind of a slacker angel named Mercury. Mercury Falls is my the first novel that I wrote, and it's just this angel he was supposed to be helping out with the apocalypse, but he gets distracted by things like beer and ping pong. He has better things to do than to be dealing with all this apocalyptic politics and stuff. So then he ends up getting pulled in, and of course it saves the world and stuff. But again, it all revolved around this character of this kind of anti-authoritarian angel named Mercury. With like the Iron Dragon books, it's totally the opposite, where I began with the problem of these people go back in time, and then they have to somehow get back into space. And I needed a crew of astronauts, spacemen, basically. And I just developed characters based on what I needed for the situation and what I knew needed to happen in the book. So it was totally the kind of the opposite with that one.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Did you make like character charts or like profiles for your characters before you started?
I have a few notes about characters, but usually I have kind of a rough idea of the character in my head, and then I start writing, and then their personality develops as I write them. And sometimes I'll write, and the character will kind of develop as I'm writing, and then I'll go back and look at things that they did in the beginning of the book, and I'll go, oh, well, that doesn't fit their character anymore, because that they're a different character than I had originally envisioned them to be. And I mean, obviously characters can change, but you don't want them to be a completely different person from one chapter to the next with no explanation, you know. So yeah, like, I mean, it's like with everything, with plotting and everything else, it develops as you go. If you're me, you know, and you're not a big planner, I have a kind of a general idea, and a lot of times I'll find that there's a lot of things that I'm assuming about the character that I have in my head, but that I haven't written down. Then I realize later on that I knew them better than I thought I did. But it's not something I'm consciously planning. It's just stuff that's in the back of my head, and I think the same is true with plots and everything else, where there's a lot of stuff that's in the back of my head that I'm not even aware of, that comes out as I'm writing. So it's like, I can't really plan it because I don't know what's going on back there. You know, yeah. It's a mystery to me. So it just happens, you know, so you have to get into the process and let it happen. Let the stuff come out. So
with your saga, you start out from, and you're plotting your book, you kind of start out from the climax and you work your way backward to figure out how you get to that point. Do you have an overarching climax in mind for the whole saga, and then one for each kind of individual novel? Yeah, more or less, yeah. I had specific points where I wanted to end each of the books, and they're a little bit like, they're not quite standalone. I mean, they're more or less satisfying. You can read the first book, and hopefully it's enjoyable, and you can get to the end and feel like something has happened that, you know, and it's like there's been a plot arc, but really you have to read the whole series to get to the at the end of the trilogy, because that's the point of the whole thing. It's more Lord of the Rings than you know, a truly episodic
kind of series where it's one book at the time, where you're reading the whole thing to see what happens with the ring in the end. I mean, you can't really stop reading the Fellowship of the Ring at the first book because it doesn't really end. So
That's a good point, though, because I know a lot of authors are, especially new ones, are getting so wrapped up in, I need to have an arc for each and every single book, and it needs to completely end, be a whole single story that wraps into the whole arc of all 3, 5, or 6 books. You have the option of, if it's going to be a series, you're planning a series, as long as it's satisfying, you don't necessarily have to include like that full, solid arc.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that as an indie author you have a little bit more freedom to do. And as somebody like me who's a little, is a little bit established, it's funny that you say that because I have an agent. As you said, I work with I publish with St. Martin's and also the Amazon's publishing imprint 47 North, and so I do have an agent. And I was kind of floating projects with him, and I told him about this one, 3 years ago or so when I was first starting to work on it, and he loved the idea, and he talked to a couple of publishers, and they said, yeah, they're really interested in it, and he said, but you have to have, basically they have to get into space in the first book. I said, well, there's no way I can do that. That's going to be like a 1,200 page book, because of all the stuff that's going to happen. There's no way. So I said, well, I'm going to do this as an indie book. And if you can't, because he thought, well, I can't sell it to a publisher if the first book doesn't have like a real conclusion. And I said, well, I'm not going to write. I don't want to write that book. I don't want to write it that way. I want to write it as like, yes, each book has an arc, but there's the big climax is going to be working up to, and that's it's 1,200 pages or something in that happens.
Well, them getting into the Viking Age and doing all the Viking stuff and then getting out, like that's kind of the whole thing, right? Like that's the fun.
Yeah, and you can't. I couldn't do that in 4 or 5, even 600 pages because I mean I have the whole second book is this siege of Paris, and there's this and the spacemen get involved in this, and they're like, and the Vikings are, and I did all this research on this, and there's this, the book is all revolves around this whole war. I mean, like I couldn't, it's a whole plot in itself with all the stuff, the politics that are going on in Europe, and it's just not something that I could do. Like I just stick in the middle of a book and have that work. I mean, it could be done again if it was like 1,000, or 1,200 page book. I could have done it, but that's I didn't want to take. I can't afford to take 3 years off and not publish anything. I have to I got to publish some stuff to make a little bit of money once in a while. So
right. So one of the questions we had from Ellen wanted to know this, and I really want to know this is, so you've worked as an indie author with freelance editors, and you've also worked with St. Martin's Press with their editors. What have you learned from working with the traditionally published publishers and editors? Learned about the writing craft, but learned specifically about developing your novel and developing your plot.
This is going to sound like really kind of pompous, but I haven't learned much from editors. Mostly because I started off self-published, and I self-published Mercury Falls, and Amazon came to me and said, I mean, and this was this was over 10 years ago now. This is like I've been doing this for like 10 years now. When Amazon was first getting into publishing, they were looking for successful indie authors to basically republish on their imprint to start their publishing company. And I was one of the people they came to and said that, well, you have this book called Mercury Falls. It's doing really well. People, like it. It's getting good reviews. So would you like us to publish it? And I said, sure. And I think that it had already been, I mean, I never really had an editor, but I write pretty clean, and I had a lot of people beta read it, and people that I trusted and stuff. So it was pretty clean. And of course, it had been out for 6 months or so at that point, and so any typos that were out there had been caught. And so I think that there were maybe 2 or 3 little copy editing things that they changed for that book. And then that kind of set the pattern for the rest of my books. Like I didn't realize, like I didn't until I started editing for people, I didn't realize like how rough some authors' work is. Like for me, I'm like, by the time I get it to the editor, I want it to be like as close to perfect as I can. And so like I never really, like Amazon never, they copy edited my stuff, but they never, I had a developmental editor on Starship Grifters, and that was the only book really that had an editor, and he even didn't really, there was a couple of things like where I got the rules of poker wrong and stuff where and there were like mostly copy editing things. And then St. Martin's, I got a little bit more, feedback, but again, it was mostly copy editing stuff. There wasn't a lot of like, I don't like this character's arc or whatever, or this plot doesn't work. Really, my agent, I guess, actually probably gave me more tips than anyone else about that. And it's stuff that I don't know. Mostly, if I had the time, I could have figured out myself. But so yeah, I don't know. I've never really been very dependent on editors, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, what have you figured out yourself then about plot development, like along the way from all that you've been reading and from all the books that you've read? How has your strategy for developing your books, for figuring out your plot, changed over the years?
Well, to be honest, with my first book, Mercury Falls, I had no idea what I was doing. Like, I didn't have a plot. I mean, I started writing this thing, and I started writing it basically as a joke, like kind of making fun of the idea of a novel. Like the whole thing was like, I wanted to make myself laugh. And I thought I just wanted to write something funny. And I thought if I laugh while I'm writing it, maybe other people will think it's funny too. And I thought if I throw enough jokes in here, make every chapter funny, then nobody will notice that it doesn't go anywhere. that I don't know what I'm doing. And so then it ended up having kind of a plot. And so then, there's this whole plot to destroy the world or whatever. And then the plot is kind of middling in that book because it's like mostly just about the characters and the ridiculous situations and stuff. And then the next few books, I started being more conscious about developing an actual plot. So by the time I got to my third or fourth book, I had a pretty good sense for setting up. And I don't know if I can put into words what I've learned. It's almost something you have to kind of internalize and kind of feel your way through. Because like I said, I didn't know, like I could explain to you what a plot was and how it worked when I wrote my first book, but I couldn't do it. And after I'd written a few, 3 or 4 or 5 books, I got to the point where I was like, okay, I can see why some of the stuff didn't work earlier. I think mostly it's a matter of, here's what it is. When I write, like I said, when I started writing humor, and obviously with humor, it's all about jokes. And so the idea of a joke is you set up a situation and you build tension, and then there's a release at the end of that. And you release the tension by giving the reader a satisfying conclusion. And the conclusion has to be appropriate. It has to fit the situation, but it also has to be unexpected. And writing plots is the same thing. You have to set the reader's expectations so that they have a feeling of what they're looking for, and so that when they get to the end, they go, "Oh, that's it. That's what I was waiting for." But they don't know necessarily that's what they're waiting for. I mean, they might, or they might suspect, or they will know, but they don't know how you're going to get there, and you're going to get there in a funny way. Or not funny necessarily, but I mean a way that they didn't think of. So there's going to be you hit that point, so you get that kind of emotional release, that endorphin blast or whatever at the end. But the reader didn't see it coming. They didn't see the end coming, or they didn't see how you were going to get there. So writing a plot in a sense is like writing a really long joke.
Yeah. the surprising but inevitable end. Like it had
Right, exactly.
I'm not sure how it was going to get there.
Yep.
So I kind of liken that to, when you're watching a movie and you're like, oh yeah, no, that person's totally going to die and she's going to run off, and everyone else in the room is like, nah, that's totally not going to happen, and then it happens.
Yeah, it's funny. I've my this girlfriend the woman that I'm dating now. She is uncanny about that kind of stuff, and it's weird because like supposed to be. I've written like 20 novels, and we'll be like 10 minutes into a movie, and she'll be like, "Yeah, this guy is going to die, and this person's going to do that," and I'm like, "How do you know that?" Like somehow she sees this stuff, and like I don't. Like I get wrapped up in it, and I'm like, "Oh, what's going to happen to this guy?" And it's like, an hour later, it's like, sure enough, that's what happens. And it's interesting because it affects the kind of movie she'll end up watching. Really, what I think are predictable movies, because to her almost everything is predictable. So she doesn't care. She likes the process of getting there. And to me, it's like totally different. So it's really strange to me. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so I'm a little.
Hey, that's why I'm sitting in the work warehouse. I'm covering shift for a girl that's not feeling very well.
A lot of good things are going around right now, or the same thing has hit a lot of people.
All right, so let's see what we have here. Ooh, here's a good one. Which of your books was the hardest to bring together and why? And also, which was the easiest? So
you cut out a little bit there. It was which was the hardest to write?
Yeah, which was the hardest to write or bring together plot-wise, characters, and which one was the easiest?
I would say the easiest was probably Starship Grifters, because I just came up with this character, and everything, like I said, everything revolved around that character, and I knew whatever crazy idea that I thought of that he should do, he was going to do. And I just kept going and kept pushing the limit. And at that point, I was still developing the character and developing the world, so I had no real restrictions on me. And it's a sci-fi book, and sci-fi, and not like hard sci-fi. So like, there's no real rules. I can break the laws of physics and everything else, because I could just explain it in terms of, hyperspace or whatever, like you do some kind of a magical explanation. So that was probably, and then, yeah. And once you've written a book, then, I write, there's still a lot of fun to write, but then I have to remember, okay, how does this magic thing that I set up in book one, how does that work? So it gets a little more difficult. And you have characters that have to be consistent and stuff and settings. So Starship Grifters was I just tore through that and wrote it in it looked like 6 weeks. And it was basically done. The hardest ones, these Iron Dragon books, just because of the scope of them and the amount of, like, if I had known how much I was biting off with these, I might not have written them, because there's so much work, because there's the historical stuff, and then there's the whole kind of, I have this sort of alternate, this far future world that I've developed with this advanced technology, but then I have to deal with like actual like 20th and 21st century technology for building rockets and solving all these problems and stuff in the Middle Ages. And so I basically have to get these people up from like Bronze Age technology to like 20th century technology, and explain how everything works, like how they smelt steel, how to turn iron into steel, and all this kind of stuff, and it's just because of that, it's been and it's just that the scope of them is huge, and so they've been a lot of work. I mean, it's very satisfying to get them done, but I'll be very happy when this last one is done, because it's just been it's been killing me. It's been a lot of work.
Yeah, one of the questions we wanted to ask you was about what qualities make for a good plot, and what sorts of things should you cut from your book because they're killing your plot, they're killing your pacing. I imagine if you've got all this technology and different cultures and different times, and you're mixing them in one book, there's going to be the temptation to do a lot of explaining, a lot of talking about the technology, and that's
Yeah.
the pacing killer right there.
Yeah, exposition is really tough. It's always tough in science fiction and fantasy because there's always a lot of backstory that you have to explain. You have to explain how the world works and how the technology or the magic or whatever works, magic system, and it's difficult to incorporate that stuff into ordinary conversation. You know, you can do the typical, as Commander so and so, that this is the way that hyperspace technology works, and so it's difficult, and to an extent, I had to just give myself permission to do a lot of exposition, and I just try to sort of pepper it through the book so that there's never like pages and pages of just exposition, but there will be like, okay, these characters will be talking about how to solve a problem, and then they'll say, okay, we're going to do this, and then I will, they'll come up with a solution, and then I'll spend 3 pages explaining how they did that, and it ends up being, there's more showing, more telling than showing in some cases than I would like. But for a book like this, it's almost unavoidable. I mean, the rule is always, for people who don't know, that you're supposed to show, not tell, and this is a problem that a lot of beginning novelists have, where they tell you what's going on rather than show you what's going on. And I think I have a pretty good sense for getting people into the action and showing, a snapshot of what's going on. But for a book like this, sometimes I just have to say, here's 5 pages of explanation for how this technology works, because there's no other way. If I was to try to work that all into, conversations or plot points, the books would be 5 times as long as they are already. I would never get to the end of them. So,
yeah, I guess you could just include it all, like include all the exposition, and then you can cut it later. Figure out later.
Yeah, there are times, right. There are times where you're like, okay, well, I went a little overboard on that. And it's hard because I know that either way I go, people will complain. They'll say, oh, well, he didn't really explain how they did this. And it's like, well, I did. But I took out those 3 pages because I wanted to bore people to tears. Or they'll be like, oh, I just went on and on. So far, I think I've hit a pretty good balance, judging by the reviews, where, but there's always going to be people who complain either way. The other thing that I find that kills plot development is, and I had a problem with this the other day, where I had to take out a section where I realized I would have basically redundancy is a problem, where I'll have a couple of characters saying, okay, well, we need to meet with so and so to talk about this, and then the next chapter is, they're talking to so-and-so about that. And then it's like, and then that happens, and then it's like, well, you really don't need all those. We can infer from the fact that they're talking about this, that they had planned to talk about this. And so a lot of times I'll end up taking out sections where it's like, yeah, so-and-so planned to talk to these people, and then they talk to these people about doing X, and then X happens. And it's like, well, how many of those steps do you really need? I try to give the reader just enough information so that they can fill in the gaps. And because then the reader doesn't want to feel like they're getting ahead of you. The reader always wants to feel like they're like, what's next? What's the next thing? Okay, I got that. What's the next thing? And so rather than saying, they're going to meet, now we meet, now we talk about this, we're going to do this, you keep things moving, where you say, you end the first meeting before they actually get into the discussion, what they're going to talk about with the next people, and then you have just a snippet of that, of what happens, hinting at what's going to happen next, and then you show what happens as a result of that, and you allow the reader to connect some dots, which makes them feel, well, it involves them in the development of the plot, so they become part of the development of the plot.
Okay. We're getting a lot of really great tips about plotting here then. First of all, show, don't tell. Show what's happening in the action. Don't necessarily just tell them what's going on. Also, don't repeat yourself. Don't have characters talk about something and then it happens later. Just show the action of it happening later. Just get to it. Also, lay down little clues, but don't, and let the reader pick up on those clues and put it all together themselves. So you can get to that ending that is surprising, but also inevitable.
Yep.
And definitely something, especially for new authors, is not going to be something that, you could just like sit at page 1 and figure out and do. That's, when you go back through and you're like, okay, I need to look back at chapter, 1, chapter 5, that you start to edit and clean up, I guess you could say. Don't expect to have all the clues and stuff written as you're writing. You can always add those in.
Yes, right.
As
Yeah.
you're going.
And then you look really smart because it's like, wow, he knew it's in the first chapter that this was going to happen in chapter 27, and it's like, yes, I did.
Yes,
I didn't at all write chapter 27 and then go back and edit chapter 1 to make it look like I was brilliant. It's
I totally didn't write chapter 13 before I even wrote the first chapter. No, we don't do that.
Right. But the reader, loves that because they'll be like, they'll hit that chapter and they'll be like, oh, there's the payoff from chapter 1, and it's like, it's easy as the writer while you're writing it, you can basically time travel, you can go back and say and fix things that didn't work, so it's you set yourself up better. So it seems like you're a much better planner than you really were. So.
Yeah, in real life you can't do that. In real life you can't think of that snappy, witty comeback right at the right moment. But you think of it in the middle of the night. But as a writer, in the middle of the night you can get up and then stick that in your book.
Or you can't go back 10 years and do that thing. You can't go back in high school and do the thing right that you were going to set yourself up for what you want to do now. Whereas in a book, if you're writing a book, you can do that. You go back and say, oh well, now what he's going to have done in high school is this. And so it gives you much more satisfying. You have much more control than you do in real life.
So a lot of what I'm getting from what you're saying is don't be so hard on yourself, where your outline and even where your plotting comes from, because you have a lot of opportunity, wiggle room, to make things work if they're not working, or to fit things in that just excite you. Try and fit in those exciting bits. Don't just be stuck on like this outline that you may have spent however long on. Right.
Yeah, just keep moving. Like, I don't know. I mean, I will often find that I am like, just like, I try to write usually 2,000 words a day when I'm actually actively writing. And sometimes I just feel like I'm totally just phoning it in. Like I'm practically just writing words to write words, and I feel like it's just not flowing today, but I'll do it and fix it tomorrow. And then the next day I'll look at it and I'll read it and I'll be like, I'll be damned, this is not half bad. Like, it's so much, like sometimes it's not great, but it's so much easier to fix a few awkward sentences than to write them in the first place, So like if the next day you look at it and it's, not great, it's much easier to make it to something that's pretty good than to just start from just from scratch or to try to do it perfect in the first place. Just write something and then come back to it, and you'll get it to that point at some point.
Yeah, that's always my favorite part, is when I have the full draft written and then I can go back in and just cut it to shreds and make it shine and all pretty. That's my favorite part.
See, I'm really bad because I'll go back and I'll do the thing that you're not supposed to do, which is to edit as you go.
Guilty.
But I'll go back and I'll go back, like, usually when I start writing for the day, I'll often go back to the 2 or 3 chapters before that I've written the day before, and it's partly just to get back into what I was doing and get the feel of it. But as I go, I'll go, oh well, that sentence doesn't work, and I'll fix it. And so then by the time as I go, I kind of keep going back and going back. So usually I've read the whole thing over, 7 or 8 times by the time I get to the end. So, which is one of the reasons why it's so clean, because then when I finally do read it over, I read the full thing over 3 or 4 times from start to finish, then there isn't that much to fix. Hopefully.
Now, one of the things you can fix in a revision stage, and that does keep readers reading and turning the page, is to have great chapter endings. That kind of hooks the reader on from that last chapter into the next chapter. Do you like chapter endings? What kind of chapter endings do you have? Is that something you kind of learn more about as a writer?
Yeah, I think that's that's important. I do try to write chapter endings that end on kind of a question, where or a cliffhanger, or something that where the reader wants to get this resolved, where they go, right at the end of the chapter, a problem, comes up. Like you're going along, and then it's like, boom, something goes wrong. Sometimes it just works where you have to, it's kind of like it's a concluding chapter where it's like it's kind of wrapping up a section, but usually it will be there'll be some kind of a question of how they're going to get out of the situation or solve some problem. Yeah, so I try to end chapters that way, so that it keeps the reader wanting to read, and it's a good kind of exercise for you as a writer to force yourself to keep coming up with those things, because if you don't have them at the end of a chapter, then you might not end up having them at all, and then you realize you've written 10 chapters where you've got no real tension or drama or questions, where this stuff has happened. If people haven't seen it, there's a great video by the South Park guys, Matt Parker and Trey Stone, I think are their names. Yeah. Where they talk about this, and it's maybe a 5-minute video, but if you look it up on YouTube, you can find it. And they talk about their writing process. And I go back and watch this thing every few months because it's so great. They talk about how if you have they have all these, when they're writing, they'll have like a whiteboard, and they'll write all the stuff that happens, and they'll write like this, here's what happens in this scene, here's what happens in this scene. And then if connecting those scenes are the words "and then you're, well, in their words, you're effed, you're screwed. You can't have "and then" between the scenes where this happens and then this happens and then this happens, because then you're putting the reader to sleep. You want to have this happens, and then because of that, this happens, or but this happens. So you either have something that flows as a result of what has happened, so it advances things to the next stage, or you hit a problem that prevents things from being advanced, and they have to come up, get around that or overcome that problem somehow. If you just have and they talk in this video about how they'll be watching movies. I mean, like professional Hollywood, big name movies that have $100 million budget, and they'll be watching this movie, and it's a scene after scene where it's this happens, and then this happens, and this happens, and then they're like, why am I watching this? This is there's no point to any of this, because it's just stuff happening. And so I try to do that. If you do that with every chapter where there's some advancement or some kind of reversal, you keep the reader engaged, because then they won't just be lulled into this, well, there's this kind of endless process of stuff happening. It's what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I've noticed two different kinds of conflict plotting with the indie books I've read. One kind of conflict plotting is you've got, I guess, one main, good guy versus bad guy, and then it just seems like bad events keep on popping up, and then you just get over one bad event, and then there's another bad event, and then there's another bad event. I think that's what you're kind of saying with the "and then." But then with other plotters, like South Park does this, you've got a central conflict in the middle that's introduced at the beginning, and it extends to the end. But all these plot lines kind of coincide and connect with that main central plot line. It's almost like one of those machines where, like, the marble drops down and the marble kicks something else over, which knocks something else over. But the whole thing is kind of interconnected, like a Dickens novel.
Right.
South Park, like Dickens, right? Like, you're not.
Yeah, it's It's a natural connection, right?
So if your chapters are oriented around one aspect of that conflict that you're developing, and that whole chapter from start to finish is kind of furthering that conflict, upping the stakes, then you're going to end on a cliffhanger, or you're gonna end on something that resolves that conflict before moving it forward to the next point, because you have a conflict there with which to resolve or move forward.
Yeah, one of the ways I kind of think about it, I think it's right in the realm of what you're thinking. I always ask myself, okay, what am I trying to say right now? So the character needs to do something. It needs to either advance the plot or surprise the reader in some way. So do I want to surprise the reader, or carry on the plot? But how can that happen? Is if I made any sense there. I don't know if it made any sense.
Yeah, and hopefully you can do multiple things at a time when you're writing. I mean, you're solving multiple problems at a time, where you're advancing the plot, and you're telling about your characters, telling something about the world. If the more of those things you can do at once, the more you can kind of engage the reader. Excuse me.
Yeah, it's definitely something our very own Josh Hayes, who's hanging out in the chat right now, keeps saying. He's like, I don't want to do one book on each of these great ideas. I want to do a single book with all three of those ideas and really get the juices turning and the tension going.
Yeah, I was thinking of Josh Hayes too, because he's a big Brandon Sanderson fan, and Brandon Sanderson says, every scene should do more than one thing. It should advance the plot, but it should also develop the characters, and it should, expose us to more of the world. It should be accomplishing all three of those if you can, or at least two of them. Which makes it more fun for the reader.
Right. Yep.
Which is ultimately our big goal. We gotta please those readers, keep them turning the pages.
Yeah.
So
yep.
See.
Well, we're getting close to the hour, so if you guys have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. But we still have this question. Kayleen, you want to hit us up with that question?
See, we did have one question earlier on in the chat from Corvo. And he asked, what does success look like to you guys in the writing world? So it's kind of not sure how as far as tying into plotting from a premise, but I guess what does success of a plot from a premise? Try it.
Making the reader laugh, I can see is one of our goals here. Making the reader laugh, getting them to be surprised with the ending, but also it kind of worked.
I kind of have a twisted goal. Like, you have the books where at the end you're just like, you're so sad but you're happy at the same time. I really want to be able to write one of those kinds of stories where you just tug at all the heartstrings. That would be success in the writing world for me. If I could have a reader send me a message, you just tug my heart out of my chest. Yes.
Yeah, that's hard to do. Like I said, when I first started, I was hoping to make. I had written a lot of. I had a blog that was basically just humor stuff, humor pieces. So I knew how to write short humor pieces, and so basically every chapter of my first novel was sort of just humor pieces that were, just kind of set pieces that were kind of strung together in the form of a plot. And then I was happy trying to just for a while, for my first several books, just making people laugh, I think was my goal, and the plot was really secondary to that. And now, I don't know, I like to have a challenge to do things differently, and so kind of hitting people on a few other emotional levels, emotional and intellectual levels, and just kind of having that some kind of a satisfying emotional response at the end is really what you're what you're aiming for, and engagement throughout the thing, because you don't want them just to be like, I gotta want to get to the end already. You want to have things happening throughout the book where it feels like they're I don't know, the texture of the situation changes so that the problem deepens, or their understanding of the problem deepens, or they become more interested in what happens as they go, as you go along. I don't know. Anyway, so it's a process, that you want to have people engaged in along the way, not just have a single goal that you're working toward.
A lot of a lot of what you've been saying, I'm kind of seeing as you have your premise, which is just like this very simple idea that can go in like so many directions, and when you begin your plotting, what kind of story do you want to tell? Do you want it to be like, in your first novel, just a lighthearted humor that, you don't really need to pay attention to the science and the nitty gritty and accuracy. It's just this fun journey that we're going on, or do you want to go into like the Earth histories and alternate that, where you're going to have to pay attention to what really did happen before you can change it, which is of course going to change how you approach your plotting and deciding on those scenes and stacking up those tensions with that.
Yeah, 'cause you're trying to re-explain history, right, with your Iron Dragon saga, except for it's these people from outer space who come and they're living with the Vikings, and they enabled the Vikings to do what they actually did do in history, right? If I'm understanding it correctly.
To some extent, yeah. It's mostly they don't. The idea is they're trying to not affect history as much as they can. So there are some things that end up happening that turns out to have that turn out to have happened as a result of them being there. But for the most part, they're trying to remain unseen, because there are also these there's this whole backstory of this interstellar war with these aliens, and some of the aliens came back with them as the thing.
Oh, okay.
And so then they're hunting the aliens are hunting them on Earth,
Right.
And so then they have to try to they're trying to get back into space, but they have to basically build a medieval space program, but they have to do this without. I mean, it would be not easy, but it would be a whole different kind of novel if they just said, okay, we're going to show up in London or Constantinople or wherever and say, we've got all this advanced technology, we're taking over, we're going to change history, and we're going to start a new empire or whatever, because if you with that kind of technology, I mean, with modern technology, you could change everything. But
right.
I didn't want to write that book. I wanted to write a book where, in the existing medieval technology situation, they develop this stuff, and they have to do it in secret, and so they can't just go to the emperor or the pope or whoever and say, here's what we can do for you. Let's establish a new empire, and then, by the way, we also want to build a spaceship. They have to be doing everything in secret, so there's all this kind of subterfuge and secrecy and politics and stuff, where they're in league with all these with the kings and dukes and stuff, and with the help of all these Norsemen, these Vikings, to do all this stuff kind of behind the scenes that doesn't get recorded in history. So anyway.
So you set up a huge challenge for yourself, because you're trying to satisfy your audience. And on the one hand, you've got sci-fi audience, with their high expectation of sci-fi, but you also have like historical fiction audience, and they want the history right too. And you've got to be
yeah. And the nice thing about the Viking period is that there's a lot of questions about about them, because they didn't really have a written language, and they didn't. So there's a lot of, if you go back that far in history, 9th, 10th century, it's pretty sketchy as far as what we actually know about them. So I did a lot of research, but there's a lot of leeway for you to make things up, and which is part of the fun of it. So I try to stick to the major events and the major the people who are were in power at that time, the major historical figures and stuff.
Mhm.
And I don't violate anything that was known to be known, but within that, I have a lot of leeway. And so far, I haven't heard from anybody contradicting me on the history. I've heard from some of the people on the science stuff, but not on the history so far. So I've crossed my fingers on that.
It'd be kind of hard because so much of it was like oral, like Beowulf, originally oral traditions passed down kind of stuff. But so with the success question, we have our audience answered back too. Rick Partlow said, "Success looks like a Lamborghini." Yeah, true. And he said, "Success needs to be something forever out of reach, or you'll believe you've achieved success and stop trying."
Interesting take. Always keep reaching for more.
Josh Hayes said, "Success looks like getting up and doing what you love every day." And J.R. Hanley says, "Success looks like a fresh cup of coffee."
So a great takeaway from what you were saying, when you're plotting, don't necessarily always take, the obvious or even like the easy, because you could, like you said, go to the higher ups and make the stuff happen and yay, it's done and still be a good story. But what makes it an even more dynamic story is the already set tension of,
Right.
they can't tell anybody, certain
Right.
people can know. So if you set your plot to already have this building tension, then you actually set yourself up for a lot more, room to play. And
Yeah, exactly. And it was actually quite a bit of work to do this. I mean, kind of planning in advance to come up with a situation like that you're describing, where there's all this tension, because because otherwise you just go to the people in charge and you take over and you say, we have this advanced technology, and it would be probably an interesting book, but it's kind of like Superman, where he's too powerful, and you have to come up with challenges that are going to be appropriate to him to keep the reader interested. You have to come up with some kind of kryptonite, and I throw some additional. And it turns out that I have more than enough challenges facing my characters, because it's a little bit ridiculous how much stuff that they have to get through. And I have some of my reviewers are saying, I hear from people saying, "Wow, you don't give them a break at all, do you?" And I'm like, no, they really don't. They don't have it easy. So, but it keeps things interesting.
Yeah. Maybe that's another clue for us as we are thinking about plotting is, keep on upping the stakes on your characters, keep on throwing curveballs at them, seeing how they'll handle it, just keep on pressing that conflict.
Yeah. I mean, because the problem is that you like these characters and you want good things to happen to them, but you have to be kind of a jerk and be like, well, you're getting too happy. Things are going too well for you. If I have a couple of chapters in a row where things have gone as planned, then things are going to go really badly pretty quick, because that's I just I have a sadistic streak where I feel like things have to get worse.
And then you don't end on that though, right? Like I can
I'm
you're a Tolkien fan, so you have happy endings, right? You gotta have
I am kind of a sucker for a happy ending. Almost all my books have some variation of a happy ending. So, not to give too much away, but good things. There's a lot of bad things that are going to happen along the way, but in the end, good things will happen too. So,
good wins out.
Well, we are a little over the hour, and I think that is a really great note to leave off of. Rob, thank you so much for joining us here on the Writer's Journey, and everyone who's watching, thank you for hanging out with us. Let us know what you thought about the show in the comments below, and be sure to give us a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button. We'd love to hear from you. For Lauren Moore, I'm Kayleen Williams. Thank you for joining us on your Writer's Journey. Be sure to come back and join us next time as we talk about reading, writing, and everything in between right here on Keystroke Media. Good night.
Night.